in the scorching heart of the Arizona desert, where nothing grows and nothing survives for long, there once stood a mansion so extravagant, so impossibly out of place, that locals called it the Mirage Palace, a European fortress rising from red dust and cactus thorns like a hallucination, the kind of home you'd expect in the rolling hills of France or the valleys of Italy, not in a land where summer temperatures cook stone to the touch. But a century ago, the Rathmore family, new money desert aristocrats with old money delusions, set out to build exactly that, a 75-room palace in one of the harshest environments in America. They carved it from imported limestone, raised towers patterned after Loire Valley chateaus, paved courtyards with hand-cut marble shipped by train, then hauled by mule into an expanse where roads did not exist. For a while, the palace stood as a glowing heart of the Rathmore's empire, a monument to wealth, ego, and the belief that the desert could be conquered by money alone. But then the ground began to shift. A sinkhole opened beneath the servant's wing. Strange lights were seen flickering beneath the property. Servants whispered of tunnels that never ended. Guests claimed to hear movement beneath the ballroom floor. And when the fortune collapsed, along with part of the mansion itself, the Rathmores vanished as quickly as they had risen. The palace was abandoned, swallowed by sandstorms, time, and mystery. Today, almost nothing remains visible above ground, just fragments, rumors, warnings, and the belief that beneath the desert floor, the Rathmore legacy still sleeps, buried in tunnels that were never meant to be found. This is the story of the most extravagant mansion ever built in the American Southwest, a palace too grand to survive, and the family who died trying to prove the desert wrong. Please subscribe and comment where you are watching from. The Rathmores were not supposed to be wealthy, not according to the East Coast families who dominated American high society in the early 1900s, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, who dismissed them as miners with delusions of nobility. They were frontier settlers, rough, ambitious, the kind of people polite society refused to acknowledge at dinner parties. But the West was changing, and Arizona, wild, untamed, rich with mineral veins, was becoming the final frontier for enormous, sudden wealth. Elijah Rathmore struck silver in 1904, not a modest vein, not a respectable find, a silver deposit so massive that miners thought it was a geological hoax. Call it luck, call it fate, call it opportunism. But overnight, the Rathmores became one of the richest families west of the Mississippi. And Elijah decided that wealth alone was enough. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted recognition from the very families who had mocked him. He wanted invitations to Newport galas, memberships in exclusive New York clubs, marriages into bloodlines that stretched back to colonial aristocracy. But when he approached them, when he offered business partnerships, when he proposed alliances, they laughed. Politely, of course. But the message was clear. New money didn't belong, especially not Western new money, stained with desert dust and mining grime. And so Elijah made a decision to define and eventually destroy his family. If they will not accept us, he told his sons, we will build something they cannot ignore. Not a house, not even a mansion, a palace, a structure so magnificent, so audacious, that the East Coast elite would have no choice but to acknowledge the Rathmore name. But where to build it? His advisors suggested San Francisco, Los Angeles, somewhere civilized, accessible, where high society might actually visit. Elijah refused. He wanted the palace in the desert, not despite its harshness, but because of it. The desert is pure land, he said in letters to architects, untamed, unforgiving, untouched by the influence of the families who rejected us. If we can build a kingdom here, where no kingdom should exist, we will forge a new American aristocracy, one they cannot deny. It was a strange belief, almost mystical, but Elijah was obsessed. In 1915, he traveled to Europe, France, Italy, Spain, photographing chateaus, Venetian palaces, Moorish courtyards. He filled notebooks with architectural sketches. He met with artisans, studied Renaissance ceilings, measured proportions of ballrooms designed for royalty. He returned to Arizona with crates of blueprints, contract with European craftsmen, and a vision that terrified even his own family. Construction began in 1917. And from the first day, the warnings came. Engineers surveyed the land and discovered instability. Dry riverbeds cut beneath the proposed foundation. Worse, they found evidence of old mining tunnels. Tunnels that predated Elijah's ownership. Tunnels from operations so old no records existed. The land, they said, was structurally unsound. Relocate the palace. Build elsewhere. Elijah refused. It must be here, he insisted, where no palace should exist. That is the entire point. So the workers began. In 115-degree heat, they hauled limestone blocks across terrain meant for scorpions and rattlesnakes. Mules collapsed carrying imported marble. Stonecutters fainted while shaping French balustrades under the brutal sun. But slowly, impossibly, the palace rose. A 3-story grand hall modeled after Venetian estates. A solarium designed to bloom roses in the desert. A marble ballroom with stained glass ceilings that refracted Arizona's sunlight into kaleidoscopic patterns. A tower library filled with rare books, locked behind antique brass latticework imported from Spain. By 1920, the Mirage Palace was the most expensive private construction project west of Chicago. And for a few glorious years, the Rathmores achieved exactly what they wanted. Respect, admiration, envy. Politicians visited. Wealthy Californians made pilgrimages. European guests marveled at the absurdity. A French palace rising from a wasteland. The East Coast elite could no longer ignore them, but they also couldn't forgive them, because the Rathmores had committed the ultimate sin of American aristocracy. They had tried to buy their way into a class that believed itself unchallengeable, and the desert, patient, ancient, unforgiving, was already preparing its response. By 1922, the Mirage Palace was complete. 75 rooms spread across wings that seemed to defy gravity and logic. French doors opening onto courtyards where nothing should grow. Venetian balconies overlooking an ocean of sand and sagebrush. It was magnificent. And it was doomed, because beneath the imported marble and hand-carved stone, something was wrong. The tunnels. From the beginning, there were whispers about tunnels beneath the palace. At first, they made sense. Cool underground passages for storage. Wine cellars. Servants' corridors designed to keep staff invisible, moving through the estate without disturbing the family. Standard features in any grand mansion. But the Rathmores built deeper, longer, stranger. Workers reported tunnels that extended far beyond the palace boundaries. Passages that seemed to connect with older, abandoned mining shafts left from operations decades earlier. Some of these shafts had no records, no maps, no documentation of who dug them or why. One construction foreman quit after claiming he heard voices echoing from empty chambers deep underground. Another reported finding tools, rusted picks and shovels, left in tunnels that supposedly no one had entered in 50 years. Elijah dismissed it all as superstition, but he also reinforced the tunnel entrances with steel doors, and he forbade anyone, family, staff, guests, from entering certain sections. Above ground, the palace functioned as intended, a symbol of power, a monument to ambition. The Rathmores hosted extravagant parties. Politicians dined in the marble ballroom. California's wealthiest families attended galas where champagne flowed and orchestras played beneath crystal chandeliers that had once hung in European estates. For a brief, shining moment, the Rathmores had everything they fought for, but the desert was patient. The first crack appeared in 1924, literally, a fracture in the marble floor of the Grand Hall. Then at first, barely noticeable, but within weeks it had widened, spread, branched like veins across the imported stone. Tiles in the ballroom began shifting. Doors refused to close properly. Windows stuck in their frames. Surveyors were called in. Their findings were alarming. One entire wing of the palace was sinking, not dramatically, just inches per year, but enough to destabilize the structure. The foundation, they discovered, was settling unevenly. Beneath the palace, the ground was hollow. The old mining tunnels, the ones Elijah had dismissed, were collapsing, slowly, silently, creating voids beneath the mansion's weight. The surveyors recommended immediate intervention. Reinforce the foundation. Fill the tunnels. Possibly evacuate sections of the palace. Elijah refused. "We have controlled this land," he said. "We will control this." But control was slipping. The water supply, drawn from a deep underground well, began to fail. The desert aquifer, engineers warned, was shifting, moving, possibly draining into the collapsing tunnels below. Without water, the palace's gardens withered. The solarium's imported roses died. The fountains in the courtyards ran dry. And then came the rumors. Servants reported hearing sounds beneath the palace at night. Not the settling of old wood or the creak of stone, but movement, footsteps, scraping. One maid claimed she saw lights flickering in the sealed sections of the tunnels, lights visible through ventilation grates. Guests began declining invitations. The palace, once the jewel of Arizona's elite, was becoming something else. A curiosity, a warning, a monument to hubris. And Elijah, watching cracks spread across the floors he had imported from Italy, watching walls shift and doors jam, finally understood something he had refused to accept. You cannot conquer the desert with money. You can only borrow its land. And eventually, it takes back what you stole. But by then, it was too late to save the palace. Or the family. Because what came next wasn't just structural failure. It was catastrophe. Please subscribe and comment where you are watching from. The beginning of the end came in 1929. The stock market crashed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Families who had seemed invincible 6 months earlier were suddenly bankrupt, their estates auctioned, their legacies erased. The Rathmores were not immune. The silver vein that had built their empire ran dry sooner than anyone predicted. Investments collapsed. Debts mounted. What had seemed like inexhaustible wealth revealed itself to be fragile, temporary, dependent on continued extraction from a mine that had given everything it could. By 1930, the Rathmores were hemorrhaging money, but Elijah refused to sell the palace, even as creditors circled, even as his sons begged him to liquidate before it was too late. "This is our legacy," he told them. "If we lose this, we lose everything." But they were already losing. Then came the fire. On a summer night in 1932, flames consumed the east wing of the palace. Guests fled in their evening gowns. Servants scrambled to save what they could. The fire brigade, such as it was in a remote desert, arrived too late to stop the blaze. By dawn, an entire wing was gutted. The official cause, faulty electrical wiring. But locals didn't believe it. Some claimed the fire started in the tunnels beneath the palace. That smoke had been seen rising from ventilation shafts before the flames reached the surface. Others whispered about sabotage, revenge from workers who hadn't been paid, or perhaps something darker, insurance fraud, an attempt to salvage something from the collapsing fortune. The Rathmores denied everything, but the fire changed something. After that night, Elijah rarely left his private study. He became paranoid, obsessive. He ordered the remaining tunnel entrances sealed with concrete. He fired half the staff. He stopped hosting guests entirely. And then, in the spring of 1933, his eldest son vanished, Marcus Rathmore, heir to what remained of the empire, 32 years old. Last seen entering the palace library late one evening. By morning, he was gone. His room was untouched. His bed hadn't been slept in. His belongings remained exactly where he'd left them. But there were signs. Dust tracks leading from his bedroom into a section of the palace that had been closed off after the fire. Tracks that ended at a sealed door, one of the entrances to the tunnels Elijah had ordered shut. The door was still locked from the outside, but the dust tracks suggested someone had gone through. Search parties combed the property. Police investigated. Newspapers ran sensational headlines about the vanishing heir of the desert palace. Nothing was found. No body. No trace. No explanation. Authorities quietly closed the case within weeks, ruling a probable runaway, a young man fleeing his family's collapsing empire. But those who knew Marcus said he would never abandon his father, never leave without a word. And those who had worked in the palace whispered a different theory, that Marcus had gone into the tunnels and found something that wouldn't let him leave. The Rathmores sealed every remaining tunnel entrance the following week. Concrete, steel doors, locks that were never opened again. By 1935, the desert had begun its final reclamation. Sandstorms ripped apart the solarium glass. Cracks in the foundation widened into structural faults. One courtyard sank nearly 2 feet overnight, its marble tiles buckling into a depression that hadn't existed the day before. And then came the sinkhole. Without warning, the ground beneath the servants' quarters collapsed, dropping an entire section of the palace into a subterranean cavern that no one knew existed. The hole was 20 feet across, 30 feet deep, and at the bottom, barely visible in the shadows, were the remains of old mining tunnels. Tunnels that connected to the network beneath the palace. Engineers declared the structure condemned. The desert, they said, was reclaiming the land. The palace could collapse entirely at any moment. The Rathmores left within a month. They took nothing, left everything. Furniture, books, paintings, personal belongings, all abandoned in rooms that would never be occupied again. Elijah died 2 years later, estranged from his remaining family, his fortune gone, his name forgotten by the society he had spent a lifetime trying to impress. The Mirage Palace, the monument he built to conquer the desert, had been swallowed by the very land he believed he could control. And deep beneath the sand, in tunnels no one dared enter, his son's fate remained a mystery. Today, almost nothing of the Mirage Palace remains visible above ground. The desert consumed it entirely. Sandstorms buried the courtyards. Wind eroded the limestone walls. Flash floods carried away fragments of marble that once lined grand hallways. By the 1950s, even the ruins had vanished beneath shifting dunes. But the palace hasn't been forgotten, because every few years someone finds something. A hiker stumbles upon carved stone columns half buried in a dry creek bed. An off-road adventurer discovers marble tiles embedded in canyon walls, remnants of floors that once held champagne-soaked galas. Urban explorers report finding ventilation shafts, rusted grates covering dark openings that descend into nothing, still exhaling cool air from somewhere far below. And treasure hunters, drawn by rumors of the Rathmore fortune hidden before the family fled, search for the sealed tunnels, convinced that beneath the sand lies not just a palace, but vaults filled with silver, gold, artifacts from a dynasty that vanished overnight. Some believe the entire palace still exists, buried intact, preserved beneath the dunes like a tomb. But no one knows for certain, because the land where it stood is still unstable. Ground-penetrating radar shows massive voids beneath the surface. Chambers, tunnels, spaces that suggest something vast and hollow waits below. But anyone who tries to excavate risks triggering another collapse. The desert, it seems, is protecting its secret. In the 1980s, a Rathmore descendant gave a single interview. She was elderly, reclusive, reluctant to speak about her family's past. But near the end of the conversation, the interviewer asked a simple question. Why did the palace really fall? She paused, then said something that has haunted researchers ever since. The palace didn't fall because of the desert. It fell because of what my grandfather built under it, and what he found there. The interviewer pressed for details. She refused to elaborate, ended the interview, died 3 months later, without ever speaking of it again. So the mystery endures. Was it simply mining tunnels, unstable ground that doomed the palace from the beginning? Or was there something else beneath the Rathmore estate? Something Elijah discovered during construction? Something that explained the sealed entrances, the strange lights, the disappearance of his son? We may never know, but the locals still tell stories of lights flickering beneath the desert at night, visible from miles away, of sounds, low rumbles, distant echoes emanating from areas where the palace once stood, of hikers who venture too close and feel the ground shift beneath their feet, as if something below is still settling, still collapsing, still consuming what remains. The Rathmore experiment was doomed from the start. A European palace in the Arizona desert was never going to survive, but their legacy lives on in warnings, in legends, in the belief that some ambitions are too grand for the land they're built upon. And somewhere beneath the sand, the Mirage Palace waits. Not gone, not destroyed, just buried, a monument to the hubris of men who believed they could conquer nature with wealth alone, and a reminder that the desert always wins. It doesn't fight. It doesn't rage. It simply waits. Patient, ancient, unforgiving, until everything built upon it returns to dust. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't done that. See you in our next video.